Picture this. A young couple, barely into their 20s, their whole lives stretching out before them like an endless highway. They're laughing, probably talking about their future, maybe about the wedding they'll never have, the children they'll never raise. They're crossing the border from Canada into the United States on a simple errand for Jay's father. A trip to pick up furnace parts. That's it. That's all it was supposed to be. 48 hours, maybe less, and they'd be back home in Saanich, British Columbia, wrapped in the comfort of their ordinary lives. But they never came home. And for 31 years, their killer walked free among us. He shopped at grocery stores. He celebrated holidays. He watched the news, probably smirking every time another cold case remained unsolved. He thought he had gotten away with murder. He thought the passage of time was his ally, erasing evidence, fading memories, burying the truth beneath decades of silence. He was wrong. If you're watching this right now, I need you to do something for me before we go any further. I need you to think about someone you love, someone whose face makes you smile just thinking about them. Now imagine them vanishing without a trace, and imagine waiting 31 years for answers that might never come. That's the weight this story carries. And if this resonates with you, if you believe that justice should never have an expiration date, then share this video. Subscribe to this channel, because stories like this one need to be told, and they need to be heard by everyone who believes that evil cannot hide forever. This is the story of Jay Cook and Tanya van Cuylenborg. November 1987. The air in British Columbia was crisp with the approaching winter, the kind of cold that makes you grateful for warm homes and warmer company. Jay Cook was 18 years old, the kind of young man that parents hope their daughters bring home. He had gentle eyes and an easy smile, a quiet confidence that came from growing up working alongside his father in the family business. He was learning the trade, preparing to take over someday, building a future brick by brick. Tanya van Cuylenborg was also 18. Beautiful, with long dark hair and an infectious laugh that could light up any room. She and Jay had been together for a while now. That special kind of young love that feels both invincible and impossibly precious. Their friends saw them together and just knew. This was a couple that would go the distance. This was the kind of love story that would someday be told at anniversary parties. The story of high school sweethearts who built a lifetime together. Jay's father, Gordon Cook, had a problem. He needed furnace parts for his business, specific components that were easier and cheaper to get in Seattle than back home in Canada. It was a routine trip, the kind of errand that young men had been running for their fathers since the dawn of commerce. Drive down, pick up the parts, drive back. Simple. Gordon asked Jay if he'd be willing to make the trip. Jay said yes without hesitation. And then he asked if Tanya could come along. A little adventure together, a chance to see Seattle, maybe do some shopping, make a boring errand into something resembling a date. Gordon agreed. Why wouldn't he? These were responsible kids, trustworthy young adults who'd never given anyone a reason to worry. On November 18, 1987, Jay and Tanya boarded a ferry from Victoria, British Columbia, to Port Angeles, Washington. Jay was driving his family's bronze 1977 Ford van, the furnace parts money tucked safely away. They had their whole lives ahead of them, and right now, the immediate future looked like nothing more complicated than highway miles and convenience store snacks. The ferry crossing took about 90 minutes. I want you to imagine them standing on the deck, watching the water churn beneath them, feeling the salt spray on their faces. Maybe they held hands. Maybe they talked about what they'd do when they got to Seattle. Maybe they were just comfortable in that perfect silence that only exists between two people who truly know each other. When the ferry docked in Port Angeles, they drove off into the Washington evening. They had reservations nowhere, a loose plan at best. They were young and in love and believed, as all young people in love believe, that nothing bad could ever happen to them. Not to them. Bad things happen to other people, people in news stories, people you didn't know. They drove south toward Seattle. The Olympic Peninsula stretched out around them, all towering evergreens and winding roads. It was beautiful country, the kind of landscape that makes you feel small in the best possible way. They had no way of knowing that somewhere out there in the darkness, their paths would cross with a monster. The last confirmed sighting of Jay and Tanya alive was at a convenience store. They bought some snacks, maybe gas, the routine necessities of a road trip. They were just kids doing kid things, completely unaware that their time was running out. That somewhere in the gathering night, a predator was watching, waiting, preparing to destroy everything they were and everything they would ever become. What happened next would haunt two nations for 3 decades. What happened next would shatter families, confound investigators, and create one of the Pacific Northwest's most infamous cold cases. What happened next would prove that evil can wear an ordinary face, can walk among us undetected, can hide in plain sight for an entire generation. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because this story isn't just about what was lost. This story is about what was found. This story is about a mother's determination, a detective's obsession, and a scientific breakthrough that would finally, after 31 years, drag a killer out of the shadows and into the light. This is a story about justice. The call started coming in on November 24, 1987, 6 days after Jay and Tanya had left home on their simple errand. 6 days of silence that had transformed from slightly unusual to deeply concerning to absolutely terrifying for the families waiting back in British Columbia. Gordon Cook knew something was wrong. This wasn't like Jay. His son was responsible, reliable, the kind of young man who called when he said he would. The trip should have taken 2 days at most. The silence was deafening, and it was saying something that no parent ever wants to hear. The Van Cuylenborg family was experiencing the same creeping dread. Tanya always checked in. She was that kind of daughter, considerate and connected, the kind who understood that parents worry and who took the simple step of a phone call to put their minds at ease. But the phone wasn't ringing. Their calls went unanswered. And with each passing hour, the fear grew heavier. Missing person reports were filed. The families reached out to authorities on both sides of the border. And then the discoveries began, each one more horrifying than the last, painting a picture of violence that would scar everyone it touched. The first break came from an unlikely source. A hunter in Skagit County, Washington, was making his way through the brushy terrain near a rural road when he spotted something that made his blood run cold. A body, partially concealed in the undergrowth. Female, young, left there like discarded refuse. Hidden, but not hidden well enough. It was Tanya Van Cuylenborg. The condition of her body told investigators immediately that this was no accident, no tragic mishap of young travelers. Tanya had been sexually assaulted. She had been shot in the head with a single bullet. She had been murdered, executed really, and dumped in the wilderness like she was nothing. Like her life, her hopes, her love for Jay, her parents' dreams for her future, none of it mattered at all. The shock waves rippled outward. Tanya's family received the news that no family should ever receive. Their beautiful daughter, their precious girl who had left home with a smile and a wave, would never be coming back. The future they had imagined for her, the grandchildren, the holidays, the ordinary miracles of a life well lived, all of it was gone. Stolen by someone who saw her not as a person, but as prey. But where was Jay? The search intensified. If Tanya was dead, the hope of finding Jay alive was rapidly diminishing. But hope is stubborn, especially when you love someone, and the Cook family clung to every shred of possibility. Maybe he had escaped. Maybe he was lost somewhere, injured but alive. Maybe, just maybe, this nightmare had a chapter that didn't end in another grave. 2 days later, on November 26th, those hopes were extinguished. Jay Cook's body was discovered in Snohomish County, approximately 60 miles from where Tanya had been found. He had been beaten. He had been strangled. His hands had been bound behind his back. Like Tanya, he had been discarded in a rural area, left in a ditch like garbage. The killer had separated them. This detail would haunt investigators and families alike. At some point, Jay and Tanya had been torn apart, taken to different locations, murdered separately. Had Jay known what was happening to Tanya? Had Tanya known what would happen to Jay? The cruelty of their final hours was almost incomprehensible. The Ford van was found on November 25th, parked at a tavern in Bellingham, Washington. The keys were still in the ignition. Inside, investigators found evidence of a struggle, hints of the violence that had occurred. They also found something else, something that would become crucial decades later. But we'll get to that. The victim's belongings were scattered across multiple counties, a trail of discarded evidence that suggested the killer had driven around the region for days, using Jay's van as his vehicle, dropping items as he went. Tanya's pants were found in one location. Her wallet was found in another. The furnace parts money was gone. Investigators began building their profile. The killer was likely local to the area, familiar with the remote roads and secluded dumping spots. He was organized enough to separate his victims and dispose of them in different counties, smart enough to know that spreading evidence across multiple jurisdictions would complicate the investigation. But he was also arrogant, keeping the van for days, driving it around like it was his. The forensic examination of Tanya's body yielded crucial biological evidence. The sexual assault had left behind DNA, the genetic fingerprint of her attacker. In 1987, DNA technology was in its infancy. The science existed, but the databases didn't. Investigators could preserve the evidence, but they couldn't yet use it to identify an unknown suspect. It was like having a key to a lock they couldn't find. They preserved everything. Every fiber, every hair, every microscopic trace of the monster who had done this. They sealed it away with the desperate hope that someday, technology would catch up with their ambition. Someday, they would find a match. Someday, justice would come. But someday was a long time away. Let me ask you something. If you knew that a killer was walking free in your community, living among you, maybe standing behind you in line at the store, maybe sitting next to you at church, what would you do? How would you live with that knowledge? And what would you sacrifice to see them finally face justice? Think about that. Let me know in the comments what you would do, because the families of Jay and Tanya had to live with exactly that reality for more than 3 decades. The investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya van Cuylenborg was massive, meticulous, and ultimately, maddeningly unsuccessful. Detectives from multiple agencies worked the case relentlessly. They interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses. They followed every lead, no matter how tenuous. They built files that grew inches thick, then feet thick, filling entire cabinets with the accumulated weight of their efforts. And they had nothing. The leads that seemed promising turned into dead ends. The suspects who emerged were eventually cleared. The tips that flooded in from concerned citizens led nowhere. The killer had left behind enough evidence to convict him 100 times over, but without a name to attach to that evidence, it was useless. It was like having a photograph of the murderer's face, but no way to know whose face it was. Years passed. The case went cold, as cases do when every avenue has been exhausted and every door has been closed. New crimes demanded attention. New victims needed justice. The files on Jay and Tanya were moved to the cold case unit, where they sat alongside other unsolved tragedies, waiting for a break that might never come. But some people refused to forget. Tanya's mother, Wilhelmina van Cuylenborg, became an advocate for the case in her quiet but persistent way. She kept in touch with investigators. She reminded them, without ever being demanding, that her daughter was still waiting for justice. She lived with the dual burden of grief and uncertainty, knowing that the man who had destroyed her family was out there somewhere, free to live a life that Tanya would never have. The Cook family carried their own burden. Jay's father, Gordon, the man who had sent his son on that fateful errand, bore a guilt that no one else imposed on him but himself. What if he hadn't asked Jay to make the trip? What if they had found another way to get the furnace parts? The questions without answers are the ones that haunt us most, and Gordon lived with those questions every day. Detective Jim Scharf of the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office inherited the case in the early 2000s. He was a man who didn't believe in giving up, a detective who saw cold cases not as failures, but as puzzles waiting to be solved. He reviewed the files with fresh eyes, looking for anything that might have been missed, any thread that might be worth pulling. The DNA evidence from Tanya's assault was still preserved, still waiting. Scharf knew that genetic technology was advancing rapidly. What had been impossible in 1987 was becoming possible in the new millennium. The FBI's CODIS database, the Combined DNA Index System, was growing every year, adding genetic profiles from convicted offenders across the country. Maybe, just maybe, The killer had been arrested for something else. Maybe his DNA was sitting in that database, waiting to be matched. Scharf submitted the evidence. He waited. He hoped. The result came back negative. The killer wasn't in the system. Whoever he was, he had either never been arrested or never had his DNA collected. He was still a ghost, still anonymous, still free. But Scharf didn't give up. He kept the case active, kept reviewing the evidence, kept waiting for the technology to catch up with his determination. And he wasn't alone. Detectives on both sides of the border, in both the United States and Canada, maintained their commitment to Jay and Tanya. They attended conferences on new forensic techniques. They networked with other cold case investigators. They never stopped believing that someday, somehow, they would find their answer. The years became decades. The 1980s became the 1990s, then the 2000s, then the 2010s. Tanya's mother grew older, her hair turning gray, her face lined with years of waiting. Gordon Cook died in 2008, never knowing who had killed his son. Other witnesses aged, some died, memories faded. The world moved on, as the world always does, leaving Jay and Tanya frozen in time, forever 18, forever young, forever waiting. And somewhere, the killer continued to live his life. He woke up every morning and went about his business. He ate meals, watched television, maybe had a family of his own. He carried his secret like a stone in his pocket, heavy but hidden. He probably believed, after 10 years, after 20 years, that he had gotten away with it. Time was his accomplice, erasing his crime from public memory, burying it under the avalanche of new tragedies that demanded attention. But time is a funny thing. It can bury secrets, yes, but it can also dig them up. It can provide the distance needed for new perspectives, the patience required for new technologies to develop, the opportunity for a single breakthrough to change everything. And in 2018, that breakthrough finally came. The year was 2018. 31 years had passed since Jay Cook and Tanya van Cuylenborg had boarded that ferry in Victoria, British Columbia. 31 years since their bodies had been found in rural Washington. 31 years of silence, of waiting, of a killer walking free. Then the world learned about genetic genealogy. You might have heard of the Golden State Killer case. Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer, had terrorized California for years, committing dozens of murders and assaults before vanishing into anonymity. For decades, he was a phantom, a boogeyman, an unsolved mystery. Then, in April 2018, investigators used a new technique to identify him. They uploaded crime scene DNA to a public genealogy database called GEDmatch, found distant relatives of the killer, and used traditional family tree research to narrow down the possibilities until only one name remained. DeAngelo was arrested. The case made international headlines. And suddenly, cold case detectives across the country realized they had a new tool in their arsenal. Jim Scharf was paying attention. He knew the evidence in the Cook van Cuylenborg case included a complete DNA profile from Tanya's assault. He knew that profile had never matched anyone in Cody's. But maybe, just maybe, it would match someone in a genealogy database. Maybe there were distant relatives out there who had uploaded their DNA. People who had no idea they were connected to a murderer. People whose genetic information could finally provide the clue that had been missing for 3 decades. Scharf reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, a company that had pioneered the use of genetic genealogy for law enforcement. They agreed to help. They uploaded the killer's DNA to GEDmatch and began the painstaking process of building a family tree. This is where the science gets fascinating. Every person shares DNA with their relatives. The closer the relation, the more DNA they share. Parents and children share 50%. Siblings share about 50%. First cousins share about 12.5%. And as you go further out, second cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins, the shared DNA decreases, but it doesn't disappear. GEDmatch contained millions of genetic profiles, people who had used consumer DNA testing services like 23andMe or Ancestry, and then uploaded their results to this public database. When the killer's DNA was compared to these profiles, it found matches. Not close relatives, but distant ones. Fourth cousins. Fifth cousins. People who shared a great-great-great-grandparent with the murderer. Now came the genealogy. C.C. Moore, a genetic genealogist who would become famous for her work on cold cases, joined the investigation. She took those distant matches and began building family trees backward in time, identifying common ancestors, then working forward again through every descendant until she found someone who fit the profile. The killer was male. The killer was likely in his 40s or 50s. The killer had been in the Bellingham, Washington, area in 1987. These parameters helped narrow the search. Family trees that didn't include men of the right age were eliminated. Branches that didn't lead to Washington state were set aside. It took less than 2 months. In May 2018, the genealogists delivered their findings to Scharf. They had identified a likely suspect. His name was William Earl Talbott II. He was 55 years old. He lived in SeaTac, Washington, and worked as a truck driver. In 1987, he would have been 24 years old, and he had lived in Snohomish County, within the very area where the crimes had occurred. But having a name wasn't enough. Scharf needed to confirm the DNA match. He needed proof that would hold up in court. Detectives began surveilling Talbott. They watched him go about his daily routine, waiting for an opportunity to collect his DNA without his knowledge. This is called discarded DNA, and it's perfectly legal. When you throw away a coffee cup or a cigarette, but you're abandoning any expectation of privacy in your genetic material. Talbott made their job easy. He disposed of a cup outside a store, and detectives collected it. They sent it to the crime lab and waited for the results. The match was definitive. The DNA on that cup matched the DNA from Tanya van Cuylenborg's assault. The genetic profile that had waited 31 years in an evidence locker had finally found its owner. William Earl Talbott II was their killer. On May 17, 2018, exactly 6 months after the Golden State Killer's arrest had revolutionized cold case investigation, detectives moved in on Talbott. They found him in his truck and made the arrest. He seemed genuinely shocked, as if he truly believed his secret was safe forever. As if he had completely forgotten the 2 young lives he had destroyed, the families he had shattered, the decades of pain he had caused. But justice has a long memory, and science had finally caught up with William Earl Talbott II. Who was William Earl Talbott II? This is the question that haunted everyone connected to the case. Who was this man who had murdered 2 innocent young people and then lived quietly for 31 years, never committing another known crime, never drawing attention to himself, never giving any outward sign that he was a monster? Talbott was born in 1963 in Snohomish County, Washington. He grew up in the area, familiar with its roads, its forests, its remote locations. In 1987, when Jay and Tanya crossed his path, he was 24 years old and working as a truck driver, a job that would have given him extensive knowledge of the local geography. He had no significant criminal record. Before his arrest for the murders, his brushes with the law were minor, the kind of petty infractions that don't raise red flags. He didn't show up in Cody's because he had never been required to submit his DNA. He was, to all outward appearances, an ordinary man living an ordinary life. But appearances lie. After his arrest, investigators and journalists began digging into Talbott's past, looking for any warning signs, any hint of the violence that lurked beneath his unremarkable exterior. They found little. He had been married briefly, divorced. He lived alone. He kept to himself. His neighbors barely knew him. He was the kind of person who could disappear into a crowd, who could commit a terrible crime and then simply walk away, blending back into society like he had never left. This is what makes cases like this so terrifying. We want to believe that killers are recognizable, that evil leaves visible marks, that we can spot the monsters among us if we just look closely enough. But the truth is more unsettling. The truth is that some killers look like everyone else. They go to work. They pay their bills. They nod hello to their neighbors. And they carry secrets so dark that exposing them to light seems almost impossible. Talbott's trial began in June 2019. The prosecution presented their case with methodical precision. They showed the jury the DNA evidence, the unbreakable genetic link between Talbott and the crimes. They presented the genealogical research that had identified him. They walked the jury through the forensic evidence, the trajectory of the bullets, the ligature marks on Jay's wrists, the unspeakable trauma inflicted on Tanya. They also presented something else, something that added another layer of horror to an already horrific case. Investigators had found palm prints on the van. Those prints matched William Earl Talbott II. His hands had touched that vehicle. The vehicle he had no legitimate reason to be near. The vehicle that had carried Jay and Tanya to their deaths. The defense had few options. They couldn't dispute the DNA. They couldn't explain away the palm prints. Instead, they attacked the process, questioning whether genetic genealogy was reliable, whether the investigation had been conducted properly, whether their client was truly guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury didn't buy it. On June 28, 2019, after less than a day of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty. Guilty of 2 counts of aggravated murder in the first degree. Guilty of the rape and murder of Tanya van Cuylenborg. Guilty of the murder of Jay Cook. In the courtroom, Tanya's brother, John van Cuylenborg, wept. Jay's sister, Laura Banstra, closed her eyes and breathed. After 32 years, after decades of waiting and wondering and hoping against hope, they finally had their answer. They finally had justice. Talbott himself showed little emotion. He sat stone-faced as the verdict was read, as if the proceedings had nothing to do with him, as if he was merely an observer at someone else's trial. This coldness, this apparent lack of remorse, said more about him than any psychiatric evaluation ever could. The sentencing hearing came later. Washington state had abolished the death penalty, so Talbott faced life in prison without the possibility of parole. Before the judge pronounced the sentence, the families were given the opportunity to speak. Laura Banstra faced the man who had killed her brother. She told him about Jay, about the kind of person he was, about the life he should have had. She told him about the decades of not knowing, the unanswered questions, the holidays with an empty chair. She told him that he had taken something precious from her family, something that could never be replaced. John van Cuylenborg spoke about his sister, about her laugh, her kindness, her love for Jay, about his parents, who had waited their entire lives for this moment. His mother was too frail to travel from Canada, but she was watching from afar, finally seeing the face of the man who had destroyed her daughter. Talbott was given the opportunity to speak. He could have expressed remorse. He could have apologized. He could have offered some explanation, however inadequate, for why he had done what he did. He declined to say anything. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 2 consecutive life sentences, one for each life he had stolen. He would die behind bars, never again walking free, never again enjoying the anonymity that had protected him for 3 decades. Justice, finally, had been served. The conviction of William Earl Talbott II was about more than just one case. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration that genetic genealogy could solve crimes that had seemed permanently unsolvable. It was a message to every killer hiding behind decades of silence that their time was running out. In the years since Talbott's arrest, genetic genealogy has been used to solve dozens of cold cases across the United States. Murders from the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, cases that investigators had essentially given up on, suddenly had answers. Families who had spent decades in limbo finally learned who had killed their loved ones. Killers who thought they had escaped justice found themselves facing handcuffs in courtrooms and prison cells. The technology continues to improve. The databases continue to grow. Every person who takes a consumer DNA test and uploads their results to a public database adds another potential connection, another path that might lead investigators to an unknown criminal. We are all, in a sense, part of a vast genetic network, connected to thousands of distant relatives we've never met. And sometimes, those connections can bring justice. But the technology raises uncomfortable questions. Questions about privacy, about consent, about the appropriate use of genetic information. When you upload your DNA to a genealogy database, you're not just sharing your own genetic information. You're sharing information about every relative you have, close and distant, known and unknown. Your fourth cousin might be a murderer. Your decision to explore your ancestry might be the thing that finally catches them. Some people are troubled by this. They argue that genetic genealogy represents an expansion of surveillance, that it turns family relationships into investigative tools, that it could be misused by governments or corporations. These concerns are not unfounded. The same technology that catches killers could theoretically be used for less noble purposes. But others argue that the benefits outweigh the risks. They point to the families finally receiving answers after decades of uncertainty. They point to the killers finally facing consequences for their crimes. They point to the potential future victims who are protected when dangerous people are removed from society. Justice, they argue, should not be limited by the technology available at the time of the crime. For the families of Jay Cook and Tanya van Cuylenborg, the debate is academic. What matters to them is that the man who killed their children is finally behind bars. What matters is that they can visit the graves of their loved ones knowing that the murder has been solved. What matters is that the long nightmare is finally over. Wilhelmina van Cuylenborg, Tanya's mother, was too ill to travel to Washington for the trial or sentencing. But she followed the proceedings closely from Canada, watching as justice was finally delivered. She had waited 32 years for this moment. She had kept faith when faith seemed foolish. She had refused to give up when giving up would have been the easier choice. After the verdict, she released a statement thanking everyone who had worked on the case. The detectives, the forensic scientists, the genealogists, the prosecutors. The people who had refused to let her daughter's murder become just another unsolved statistic. The people who had believed, as she had believed, that justice delayed did not have to mean justice denied. She passed away in 2020, having finally seen her daughter's killer brought to justice. She died knowing that Tanya had not been forgotten. She died knowing that the monster who had destroyed her family would never be free again. Her death was a tragedy compounded by relief. A mother should never have to wait 32 years for justice. A mother should never have to carry that weight. But at least, in the end, she didn't have to carry it anymore. Let me take you back to that ferry crossing one more time. November 18, 1987. Jay and Tanya standing on the deck, watching the water, feeling the spray, looking ahead to their simple adventure. They had no idea what was waiting for them. No idea that these were their final hours of freedom, of safety, of life. I think about them often. I think about the alternative timeline, the one where they completed their errand, picked up the furnace parts, and drove home safely. In that timeline, they probably got married, probably had children, probably celebrated countless holidays, weathered countless challenges, built a life together that lasted decades. In that timeline, their grandparents now, surrounded by family, telling stories about the adventures of their youth. But that timeline doesn't exist. It was stolen from them, stolen from their families, stolen from the world. And no amount of justice can bring it back. This is the hardest truth about cases like this one. Even when the killer is caught, even when justice is served, the victims remain dead. The years remain lost. The future remains erased. Jay Cook and Tanya van Cuylenborg will never come back. They will never grow old. They will never know how their story ended, how their deaths were finally avenged, how their killer was finally punished. What we can do is remember them, not as victims, not as case numbers, not as statistics in a true crime documentary, but as people, as a young man with gentle eyes who was learning his father's trade, as a young woman with an infectious laugh who was deeply in love, as two kids who were just trying to run a simple errand and had the terrible misfortune of crossing paths with a predator. Jay's sister, Laura Banstra, has become an advocate for cold case families. She speaks about her experience, about the decades of waiting, about the moment when she finally got the call that a suspect had been identified. She helps other families navigate the labyrinth of the justice system, offering the wisdom that only comes from having walked that painful path yourself. John van Cuylenborg carries his sister's memory forward. He speaks about Tanya at every opportunity, keeping her alive in the consciousness of the public. He refuses to let her be reduced to a name in a file, a tragic headline, a cold case statistic. She was his sister, and she deserves to be remembered as a complete person, not just as a murder victim. The detectives who worked the case carry their own memories. For Jim Scharf, the Cuylenborg case was the defining challenge of his career. He never stopped believing it would be solved. He never stopped pushing for new techniques, new approaches, new ways of finding the answer. When genetic genealogy emerged as a viable tool, he was ready. He had been preparing for that moment for years. For him, the arrest of William Earl Talbot II wasn't just a professional victory. It was personal. He had spent years with Jay and Tanya, studying their files, examining their photographs, imagining their final hours. He knew them, in a strange way, better than most people who had actually met them. And bringing their killer to justice was an obligation he felt in his bones. This is what sets great detectives apart from merely competent ones. The competent detective treats each case as a job. The great detective treats each case as a sacred trust. They carry the victims with them, not as burdens, but as companions, until the day when justice allows them to finally set down that weight. So where does this story end? It ends in a courtroom in Washington state, with a jury pronouncing a murderer guilty. It ends in a prison cell, where William Earl Talbot II will spend the rest of his natural life. It ends with two families finally receiving the answers they had waited 32 years to receive. But really, this story doesn't end at all. It continues in the lives of everyone it touched, in the memories that endure, in the lessons that resonate. The lesson of persistence. For 32 years, investigators refused to give up on Jay and Tanya. They preserved the evidence when preservation seemed pointless. They maintained the files when the case seemed hopelessly cold. They waited for science to catch up with their determination. And when the opportunity finally came, they were ready. The lesson of technology. The same genetic technology that helps us trace our ancestry can help us trace our criminals. DNA is a language, and we are finally learning to read it fluently. The cold cases of the past are being warmed by the forensic tools of the present. The unsolved mysteries are slowly, steadily being solved. The lesson of justice. It may be delayed, but it need not be denied. Time is not always the ally of the criminal. Sometimes, time is the ally of the investigator, providing the distance needed for new perspectives, the patience required for new technologies, the opportunity for a single breakthrough to change everything. And the lesson of love. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg loved each other. Their families loved them. That love endured through 3 decades of uncertainty, through countless disappointments, through the slow erosion of hope that comes with years of waiting. And in the end, that love was vindicated. Their memories were honored. Their lives, though tragically short, were given meaning by the determination of those who refused to forget them. William Earl Talbot II thought he had gotten away with murder. For 31 years, he lived with that belief. He woke up every morning, free and unpunished, confident that his secret would die with him. He was wrong. The science he never anticipated revealed his identity. The detectives he had evaded tracked him down. The justice system he had escaped finally caught up with him. And now he sits in a prison cell, where he will remain until the day he dies, surrounded by concrete walls and the knowledge that his crimes were not forgotten, that his victims were not abandoned, that his freedom was always, always temporary. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg deserved so much more than they got. They deserved long lives, full of love and laughter and all the ordinary miracles that most of us take for granted. They deserved to grow old together, to watch sunsets from the porch of the house they built, to hold grandchildren in their arms. They didn't get any of that. What they got was 32 years of waiting, and then, finally, justice. It's not enough. It can never be enough. But it's something. It's a victory, hard-won and long delayed. It's proof that evil does not always triumph, that killers do not always escape, that the arc of the moral universe, though long, really does bend toward justice. If you've watched this far, you understand something important. You understand that these stories matter, that remembering the victims matters, that pursuing justice matters, no matter how many years have passed. So subscribe to this channel. Share this video with everyone you know. Help us tell these stories, honor these memories, celebrate these victories. Because every cold case solved is a message to every killer still hiding in the shadows. We are coming for you. Science is advancing. Databases are growing. The past is not as safe as you thought. Your secret is not secure. Justice is patient, and justice never forgets. For J. Cook and Tanya van Cuylenborg, the long wait is over. Their story ends not with tragedy, but with triumph. Not with the darkness of unanswered questions, but with the light of truth finally revealed. Rest now, Jay. Rest now, Tanya. Your killer will never hurt anyone again, and your memory will live forever.